It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Song tonight. Perhaps some of you already know her from taking her course, but she's part of the Bair Lab, BAIR, the Berkeley Deep Drive Lab, the RISE Lab, co-founder of the Initiative for Crypto Securities and Decontracts Lab. And just 2 years ago, she founded Oasis Labs, focused on consumer privacy as well as data sharing. Not that you hear those two things together very much. Within the first 4 months, she raised over 45 million from VCs. And one of the investors is tonight's speaker. She still finds time to teach with everything that she's doing and being in China. And next semester, she'll be teaching CS 199, the Intro to Artificial Intelligence. She has a number of patents, and I was saying this earlier, at least one with tonight's speaker. She is also the recipient of a number of awards, including the MacArthur Fellowship, the MIT Technology Review TR35, and was named to Inc.'s Female Founders 100 list and Wired's 25 list of innovators. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dawn Sung from China.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the intro. So yeah, thank you. So let me actually introduce the guest tonight, Ashar Aziz. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Ashar. Ashar is an amazing serial entrepreneur. So first, Ashar also has strong ties with Berkeley. So Ashar got his bachelor's degree in ECS from MIT, but Ashar made the correct decision for his master's degree. He received his master's degree from UC Berkeley in ECS. So go Bears. And as I mentioned, Ashar is an amazing serial entrepreneur. He has done many companies so far. And so he first founded Terra Spring. And before that, he was at Sun Microlabs and so on. And after Terra Springs, Ashar founded FireEye in 2004. And I was very fortunate to also have worked with Ashar at FireEye, first as advisor, and also later on, my earlier startup was acquired by FireEye as well. FireEye is a really successful company in cybersecurity and is $1 billion. It has billions of dollars in market cap. And after FireEye, Ashar also Ashar is the chairman of Bedrock Systems, an early-stage cybersecurity company focused on formally assured computing. This is another great example showing Ashar's deep insight and also really as a pioneer in actually cutting-edge research applying to the real world. The company focuses on formal verification, which is really uses cutting-edge research technologies to help improve security of real-world systems. And now, Ashar is a founder and executive chairman of Sky Electric Inc. He's a creator of the core energy intelligence and management technology embedded in the Sky Electric Intelligence Solar Plus storage systems. And also, this is another great example that Ashar, besides being an amazing serial entrepreneur, is an amazing creator. I guess also as a successful entrepreneur, you have to be a successful creator to start with. So in all these companies that Ashar has founded, essentially Ashar is the brainchild of all these companies and is a creator of the technologies in most of these companies. And I'm also really fortunate to have Ashar as my dear mentor and friend. And one thing I remember really well, that every time I talk to Ashar, every time when I have, I think, a brilliant idea that I try to explain to Ashar how it's going to change the world and some really exciting new technology research that I have done. Ashar always reminds me that do not look for a problem without solution. You need to start with a problem and then build the best solution for that. And I think this is a particularly important lesson especially for researchers and technologists, where we tend to focus on building just new research ideas, new technology, but without actually oftentimes focus on understanding what is the actual important problem that we really want to focus on solving in the real world. And hence, right, so yeah, I really, really appreciate all these great lessons that I have personally learned and benefited from Asha. And with that, let's welcome our speaker, Asha. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dawn, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Vicky. And hello to everybody on the webinar here. I'm excited to speak to a group of UC Berkeley students. It's exciting for me. My talk is titled The Art and Science of Disruptive Innovation. And what I'll try and talk through in the next hour or so is both elements of this, which is the art part and the science part. I believe there is a science you can apply to commercializing innovation, and then there's an art form to figuring out what is the disruptive innovation that you should be focused on. So I'll touch upon that, and I'll talk about my own companies and how I thought about the
Do you?
I think oh, okay. All right, okay. Before I do that, I'll say a little bit about my time at UC Berkeley. Vicky said, hey, you've got a whole bunch of students from Berkeley. Why don't you talk about what you did there? And these are two pictures from one of the apartments that I lived at when I was at Berkeley. And here you can see me diligently working, I guess, on my master's project. I changed a lot of apartments while I was at Berkeley, and I changed my program focus about equally often. So I started off in plasma physics at UC Berkeley in the EE department. I quickly shifted focus to quantum electronics. And right after that, I shifted focus to computer science, and I ended up doing my master's project in developing the back end of a silicon compiler for laying out ICs. So that's sort of like the journey that I went through at Cal. I touched on a number of different areas. And I guess the moral is you don't have to particularly know what you are going to be focusing on. It's okay to try and experiment and find the thing that works best for you. And so I tried all these very different kinds of subjects, and I ended up focusing on computer science and computer technology. All right, so the two startups that I focused on early on, one is TerraSpring, the other is FireEye. And I want to talk about TerraSpring because TerraSpring was not a very good outcome for either the investors or for myself. I guess you could consider that a failure. But we learn a lot from our failures. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about now is how to use failures as a learning exercise and not as a reason to get depressed or despondent. All right, so TerraSpring, I started this in 1999. So this was at the height of the dot-com boom. I started the company essentially over a conversation with a former vice president at Sun Microsystems who used to be a colleague. And I was living in an apartment, as it turns out, on Sand Hill Road at the time. And I was looking at what was happening with all the infrastructure that was being built for e-commerce, all these dot-com companies. And this is going to be, most of you don't know this, but in those days, you used to have to rent a cage in some kind of a co-location data center and build your own infrastructure from scratch. Servers, rack and stack, cabling, storage, networking. Everybody was kind of doing it on their own. And that struck me as a very inefficient thing to do. So I proposed a different model to do it. And I proposed that model to my former VP, and he said, that's a great idea. Why don't you build a company around it? I said, oh, okay, why not? He said, I'll write you a $500,000 check, come in here and we'll figure something out. So that was the genesis of my first startup. So I talked to two former colleagues of mine. from Sun Microsystems, and I said, let's go build this company here. And I'll talk about the company, but I'll talk a little bit about the fundraising exercise. So the first $500,000 was a piece of cake. But there are always speed bumps in the road that you have to manage in terms of the fundraising exercise. So we had multiple offers for our Series A lead round from multiple tier 1 companies. And one of them made a really good sales pitch to us. And I won't say who it is. It's a very well-known firm. And so I turned down the other offers at the time. But thankfully, I turned them down in a very polite way, because they ended up reneging on their offer because they realized that my company was competitive with another very famous entrepreneur's company, and they did not want to fund 2 competitive deals. They didn't realize it at the time that they made the offer. And so then we were left kind of a little bit of a lurch. So thankfully, the persons who had made us the offer earlier had good graces, and they agreed to fund us. And so I had the $10 million Series A from MDV and Accel that was closed in the 1999 timeframe. All right, so what happened here? Okay, let's talk about what the concept was. The concept was that computing needed to be viewed as an elastic resource on demand. That I should be able to create my compute infrastructure on the fly. I should be able to add compute storage resources as and when I need it, and I should not have to recable vast amounts of infrastructure and boxes and equipment in order to do that. Today we call that the cloud. The word cloud did not exist then. So this was a circa 1999 elastic computing in the cloud company. I just went and checked AWS website as to when it launched. It launched in 2006. And if you look at their website, it seems like there was never this concept before, but my company was trying to do cloud computing, elastic, on the fly resources, probably 4 or 5 years before they started that. So, seems to be generally the right concept. So what went wrong? Well, I actually raised a ton of money for this company. I raised about close to 70 million in venture capital after the initial 10. I even did 30 million in revenue in first year, right? So that sounds like a pretty good deal, 0 to 30 million in one step. But the reality was that this was very, very poorly executed. The initial vision was to build data centers from scratch, including the physical building. So the capital intensity of that plan was close to $1 billion. When the capital markets crashed, that became an untenable vision. So we had to step back and try to think about a lower capital intensity model, a pure software model. So we were still trying to do infrastructure as a service, but the software model also was not well executed because it wasn't turnkey software, because it was originally designed as a service. It wasn't really designed to be shrink wrap software. And there was a lot of friction in the sales cycle to show how this works. And before we got any of that, we had ramped up sales and marketing in a pretty heavy way, right? So these are all the things not to be done. When you have that much capital on the table, you can survive a long time. You can survive a recession or two if you have to, as long as you manage the cash properly. So we ran out of the money, close to $100 million. So that's why I called it my $100 million startup crash course. And you know, we thought grad school was expensive. Well, this was pretty expensive. But you know, it was a learning experience, and hopefully you guys will not repeat the mistakes, the kind of mistakes we did here, because I'm going to share all those things with you now. Now I'm going to step back, and so let's just step full cycle as to how to think about the innovation in the first place, right? What is the method? Is there a method? There is a rough method. It's part method, part art, because you have to apply imagination to the first 2 steps of it. And the key here is to find an undersolved problem in an emerging market where the problem on a secular basis gets worse over time, and the existing approaches fail to meet the trajectory of the worsening problem, right? So this is why this is part art, because this is not well taught. This area of problem discovery is not a well taught and well understood discipline, but this is the area where the entrepreneur needs to focus on. And I'll say this because Don already mentioned this. It's the most natural thing for people to do is to focus on what they've already built, already researched. But it may or may not map to this kind of widespread problem, right? That's why I say take what you have figured out, whatever research you've done, put that to one side and think about problems in the market in the abstract. Begin with that, because that's a great way to begin the entrepreneurship journey. Now, the second step requires an equal amount of imagination, which is defining a solution that perfectly fits that problem statement. So out of the abstract, you've defined the contours of this problem. And defining the contours of this problem is important because your solution will fit perfectly within the contours of that problem. So problem discovery and solution definition is the first part of this exercise. Remember, there is no design being done here. You actually don't necessarily know how to build this yet. And you may say, that sounds fanciful. If I don't know how to build a solution, what's the point? But bear with me. The point is, if you are able to build such a solution, then it can have traction in the market, and it's a solution worth trying to figure out, right? So once you've created a solution that you've arrived at from this process, if you're able to discern such a solution, right? And you may say, that sounds like, well, what if I can't? But the company that I started next was done exactly in this method, which is I actually did not know how to solve the problem. I figured out how to solve the problem, but I was working on the problem definition first. If you do this in the reverse, here's this great technology. Well, does it map to a problem? And does it fit the problem boundary as well as the problem statement? And you'll find that more often than not, it's not so easy to thread this needle in the reverse direction. Going in this forward direction is the best way to do it. And you may have to iterate in the 1 and 2 steps, but that can be done. All right, some more advice. This is how I think about it. So some more advice about how to imagineer the innovative solution. And again, more fanciful stuff. How do you think about the perfect solution? Well, imagine you have magic, okay? And I say that because with magic, you can create what you want. So imagine that there is no restriction on what can be done. And if a perfect solution could be found for this growing undersolved problem, what would that perfect solution look like? And now you have a definition, which is the external aspect of that solution. It's desirable attributes. So the efficacy in solving the problem and the usability of the solution, these two are the most important things to focus on first. The second lesson from my previous startup, the sales cycle friction has to be low. So the amount of work that has to be done from demonstrating it to a customer to them getting it to show value has to be a low amount of work. And this needs to be part of the problem statement. If it takes a lot of effort to figure out how to go build this perfect solution, and then the customer has to do a lot of different things to get it to be usable, well, that's not a great solution. So the solution should encompass not just steady state usage, but from the initial sales cycle to the getting the value out of it, part of the value proposition. Another thing to think about, my bias, and again, academics and researchers will have a different bias, is to think about the solution as a point solution. It's narrowly focused on an urgent pain versus a general purpose architecture or a general purpose ecosystem that could be useful if you added lots of things to it, but it's not useful out of the box. And the reason for making a point problem is, and a point solution is, customers buy point solutions from startups. They buy ecosystems and platforms from large tech companies. So when you are not trusted to provide a platform or an ecosystem, what you need is a Trojan horse. And that Trojan horse is your point solution. You may design the point solution with the mindset that it will ultimately become a platform and that there'll be an ecosystem around it. So in the engineering and architecture, you can think of it that way. But present it as a focused point solution, because an architecture by itself will have a hard time being sold from an unproven startup into demanding customers. Okay, now, the reason I talked about making the perfect solution is it allows you to think about the solution from a completely different lens, and it encourages radical innovation versus incremental innovation. If you throw aside the boundaries of what is possible, then you are able to think about what could be a radical change in the way you are attacking the problem versus an incremental change, because you're bound by the limitations of existing products. You accept the limitations of the existing products in your mind, and they subconsciously bind you to a mindset. Discard all of that. All right, so while that may sound pretty fanciful, this is exactly what I did to start FireEye. All right, so FireEye, I started this after I left Sun, and I was sitting in my living room. I didn't make a lot of money from the acquisition of TerraSpring, so I had roughly 12 months of cash, and I used those 12 months of cash as my seed capital to figure out my next startup. So that's a pretty high motivating function, by the way. When you're running out of cash, you're highly motivated to figure out what you need to do. Where did I stumble upon the problem of advanced cyber attacks and malware? Well, I found it in a DARPA problem statement. And why was I looking at a DARPA problem statement? And this has to do with my previous startup. When TerraSpring was acquired by Sun, I spent 2 days with the US Navy. And I discovered that they had very stringent requirements for advanced data centers, because ships are essentially floating data centers. And they had written a thick document on the operational requirements for a next generation advanced data center. And I took that book home and I said, this is a very well written document from a very sophisticated class of enterprise customer who know what they want. And it would have been very beneficial for me to have studied this as I was building the TerraSpring technology. So I said, okay, perhaps they have described other problem statements, and perhaps I can solve that. And so they had written the requirements of finding and stopping attacks which were highly stealthy, sophisticated, and had no previously known signature, and were targeting unknown software vulnerabilities. And this was kind of a holy grail problem in cybersecurity, because you had two classes of solutions. One was signatures. I've seen the attack, so I'll create a bit pattern for it either on the file, which is antivirus, or on the network, which is IPS, IDS, or I'll use some vague form of anomaly detection. And there were a lot of anomaly detection firms, and the DARPA statement was assuming that there'll be some kind of anomaly detection. And since anomaly detection is not perfectly correlated with malicious activity, they assumed there were going to be lots of false alerts. So, idealized solution. What's the ideal solution in this scenario? What's the perfect solution if you could have magic? The perfect solution would find an attack that it knows nothing about with perfect precision, never miss the attack, no false negative, and never false alert, 0 false positives. So I used that as the aspirational goal for the FireEye solution. Clearly, signatures won't solve it because they can't find things they don't know about. And plain old anomaly detection will not figure it out because it's going to false alert a lot. So this was my introduction to the domain. And I was not a researcher in malware, and I was not a researcher in this area, although I ended up hiring some of the lead researchers after I started FireEye in this area. So, so I had this notebook that I was taking notes on. It's just me sitting in my living room at this point in time with a laptop. The laptop allows me to download boatloads of research papers, and the notebook I use to play cyber chess with myself. So I would come up with, and so I became very well educated on how to be an attacker because I was attacking my own defending architecture, right? So it's like that, Go game, which is sort of playing with itself, and it's kind of stupid on both sides, but it's getting better on both sides simultaneously. So that was me playing cyber attack and defend chess with myself, getting simultaneously better as a defender and attacker as time went by. And so I started this, I came up with this notion that if I could analyze these attacks in perfectly baselined environments in a virtual machine, kind of like a petri dish, and I could discover anything that went wrong in this petri dish environment, attacks are typically operating in the open, right? They're looking at network traffic where there's lots of unknowns, or actual laptops where there's user activity. So it's very hard to discern normal user versus malicious activity and trying to figure out the difference between those. But a petri dish allows you to analyze something that is going to stick out in the petri dish. And so these virtual machines were my virtual petri dishes. And my goal was to take this attack, which is flying by on the wire, and teleport it by studying its DNA. And its DNA was essentially protocol. I would recreate that protocol inside my virtual machine, which would infect my virtual machine. And then I could discover this attack with perfect precision. And I took anomaly detection upside down. It's designed to minimize false alerts. I flipped it around and I said, you're designed to minimize false negatives. Don't miss the attack, which means it's stripping constantly. So I use that as a front-end filter to feed into my virtual machines. And that is, in essence, and in a roughly 2-minute description, the essence of the FireEye technology. And it ultimately acted as a near perfect attack detector on attacks I actually knew nothing about. And this, of course, far exceeded the DARPA goals, which assumed lots and lots of attacks, lots and lots of false alerts on a daily basis. Our false alert rate in production was less than 1 or 2 every so many months. And that was just a virtual machine, sort of a fix that could be applied. So, so that's the genesis. I presented this idea to a number of enterprise customers, again, sitting in my living room. And when I got positive feedback on that, I raised a seed round from Sequoia Capital, and I moved into the incubator. And so this is basically talking about the worsening problem, that there will be these advanced attacks, targeted, unknown, 0-day, unlike viruses and worms of the past, and we needed a new solution. And by the way, since 2004 to 2020, this has never stopped. This just has been worsening, and we still have this problem today. And we have it in spades from nation states. And these things will go through your entire existing cyber defense architecture of the day that it existed at the time. So this is a Series A slide deck that I put together. And I put this together in my living room before I actually had my $250,000 seed round. So obviously there was no such product. I'm just telling you how I cobbled this together. I photoshopped that, right? So that actually did not exist. I made a picture up because I wanted to convince customers to have a conversation with me. If I didn't have anything to show them, they wouldn't talk to me. So I pretended I had something here when I actually just had a picture. So that was sort of part A. And why did I focus on building a network appliance here to begin with? Why not put something on the endpoint or something different? And it goes to the point that I made earlier. If I put it at the network gateway of the architecture of the enterprise, it's going to see all the traffic going in and out. And my claim is you are being infiltrated today and I will show you with this product, because they won't believe me that they're being infiltrated. And if I see all the traffic, then I have a much greater chance of showing that they are being infiltrated, versus if I built something for the endpoint and they said, okay, we'll try it on these 10 machines here. Well, these 10 machines may or may not get attacked. So my chances of finding something they're missing on a small subset of their desktops or laptops was much lower, versus if I looked at everything. So the whole idea was that the demo phase of this should go really well, that I'm seeing everything and it's not intrusive. I just plug it in and they don't have to trust me that I'll take down their network or something, because I can do this in a passive monitoring mode. That was the idea. And then if I find something, then I would share it with all my other devices, kind of like a cyber threat intelligence NORAD center, right? So this was the two components. We actually built both these components and it's still in operation today, and it's a pretty vast infrastructure today. But that was the original thought, and this is my Series A presentation slide that I'm showing you. All right, so now, even with all of those, that thinking behind the problem and the solution and thinking about it perfectly, things don't always go perfectly. And this is where how you build a company and how you manage it is really important. The first thing that happened was that the threat evolved. Now, the bad guys were not writing me letters telling me what they're planning to do. So I was looking at the threat vector where it was actively propagating, and they shifted to passive infiltration via a web page, aka web malware. And I discovered that by reading a paper from Google while I was building this, that 10% of their Google cache was actually malicious content. So I figured they had massively shifted gears. So I had to redo the front-end capture to look at web traffic versus general purpose network traffic, and use that as a filter to feed a virtual machine where I have a variety of web browsers, and to see if those get attacked in real time. So that iteration took some time. So what happens is the first version of the product actually gets sold. So you have this false sense of product market fit, and you build a sales team, but it's not a repeatable sales cycle. So what do you have to do if you cannot repeat the sales cycle? You can't have a sales team, because you don't really have product market fit. It's an illusion. So I had to fire the entire sales team in the middle of this product iteration, because they were gonna run me out of cash. So we finally made the version of the web product by late 2008. But as luck would have it, that was just as the global economy was collapsing. Right? So at this point in time, because I was just coming out with the product and the proof was still out there, most of the engineering team quit, most of the management team quit, and half the investors at least wanted to shut down the company. Now, I was in discussion with some parts of the US government. So it started off with DoD, and then we're back to the US government. And they were painfully aware of the fact that they were being attacked from nation states. And they said, we want to try this technology because nothing else that we have has been succeeding in finding these attacks. And actually, the reason I got funded in 2009 was the US government came in, part of it, and led that investment. So I made my Series D round in 2009. And we went from close to zero revenue in 2006, 7, 8, in 9, with zero sales force, with me as the sales guy, we got close to $4 million. And that allowed me to get my next round of funding and build a real sales force for good this time. And we went from 4 million to 16 million in bookings to 64 million to 136 to 256. That's the year-over-year trajectory. So that and part of this journey is not just adapting the product, it's also figuring out what you call it and how you describe it to the customers. In effect, we were selling into a non-existing product category. It was not a firewall. It was not an antivirus system. It was not an IPS. So I asked my sales team to talk to customers and say, how do they refer to this problem? And as luck would have it, the US government had a term for it. It was called Advanced Persistent Threat, APT, that they used as a politically correct way to refer to China and Russia and all these countries, because they don't want to say in their documents, we're talking about China, or we're talking about Russia, or we're talking about all these countries. So they used the word APT. So I used APT in my product messaging, and we became a market leader in defending against APTs, loosely translated nation state level attacks. And we became an early market leader in that. And so then we did our IPO in 2013, and FireEye just announced for Q3 about 240 million in revenue, so it's close to $1 billion annualized run rate at the moment. I left the company about 4 years ago to work on new things. So that's sort of the FireEye journey. I'm going to summarize the key lessons because I think these are important. The first is you have to iterate to product, message, channel, market fit. People think about product and market fit, but there's a message in there, and the message isn't obvious necessarily. And the message is not something you want to concoct on your own. You want to find a message that is what the customer is already saying about their own problem. So find resonance with what the market is saying. That's why I picked APT. The channel is also important. I won't spend too much time on that topic right now. But if you are in an undefined product category, getting a regular channel is very hard to do. So you have to start off with direct sales. If you have a consumer product, again, you have to think through what is the right channel for initial sales and what is the right channel for scaled up sales. But the answer is the same. You have to conduct an experiment of a product and a message and a market to see, is this repeatable? And can I build scale and volume before you invest too heavily in it? And if you make a false step, quickly realize that and cut back on your expenses because you're going to run out of cash. All right, so that's the intellectual part. When the failure occurs, you're going to have to find ways to deal with it. And maybe I was exceptionally unlucky, but I think the reality is when you have this many number of unknowns in a startup, there will always be failures because you cannot predict all the various things that have to come right. So you have to be prepared for it because this is part of the journey. There are two elements of dealing with failures. One is don't let your emotions get the better of you. You can't do that. As the leader of the company, it's your job to lead. So you can't let the emotions drag you down. The second thing you have to do is you have to look at what class of failure I'm dealing with and how do I fix it, right? And I've touched broadly on these 4 or 5 different classes of failures. One is your basic concept is wrong, right? After all that exercise, you still got it wrong. The dog doesn't hunt. There is no urgency to the problem. You can't get people to part money for your solution. That's a very hard thing to recover from. And the only way to really recover from that is to pivot more broadly into something different, assuming you have the cash left to do that. More commonly, it's a concept instantiation failure. The concept was right, but the instantiation of that concept is wrong. That's actually what happened in my first company. There was a concept instantiation failure coupled with execution failure, such as premature spending on go-to-market exercise. So these two things compounded, otherwise, we could have been a gigantic cloud computing company. But because the instantiation of the concept was wrong, and we managed to flush $100 million down the toilet in 2 years, that's a tremendous execution failure. So figuring out the concept instantiation failure, you have to take honest feedback. And this is where you have to put your ego to one side and just take the honest feedback in the early customer trials. What's right, what needs to be fixed. And a rapid iteration can fix the concept instantiation failure. You also have to mind the team and the culture issues. I'm a firm believer in having a very clear hiring spec for every position on the management team. And the hiring spec is, this is the job you're going to do. So you had to have shown success at having done the same job in a prior life. So if I'm trying to get from 4 million to 100 million in revenue, I don't want the sales leader who took some large company from 1 billion to 1.2 billion. That sounds like a good achievement. It's not. You want the guy who can take you from early to a large number, because it's a very different skill set. So having a very precise spec for each position on your management team is critical. Think of that as the blueprint for your organization. And your job as the entrepreneur, product aside, is really to build that organization, because the organization will ultimately build it and sell it and support it. Hiring is not a perfect process. I've figured that out over the years. And when you make a hiring mistake, don't dither on fixing it. That means firing. Don't dither on the firing. And first-time entrepreneurs sort of stumble on this front because they're trying to be nice and empathetic, but empathy doesn't suit you well in this part of the running the business. And lastly, you scale your business, which is other parts of the business, as a trailing function of sales. So as you're getting sales, then you invest in the other activities, but not prematurely. The only thing you want to invest is experiments on product, message, market fit. If those experiments are successful, then sales will grow, and then you come back and you fix other things. You can let other things break. You can let them be understaffed while you're fixing the front end of the company. All right, so that's the quick overview of my first two companies. I'm now an investor in a number of early stage technology companies. I launched my latest cybersecurity company that Don was alluding to, Bedrock Systems. It's about ensuring that we have a true secure foundation for all of computing, cloud, IoT, every form of computing, by ensuring that the trusted computing base cannot be attacked, by formally assuring its security. And that's a very big element that I think we need for 21st century computing stacks. And I've also built another company on clean energy and instantiating that as a distributed power grid. All right, I'm going to summarize it here. I've said all these things, but just for the summary, the art is in figuring out this undersolved problem. This is really where entrepreneurs should think and focus, right? Forget about your PhD thesis, what you have done. What you have done or learned to date is sort of an accident of history. That may or may not be relevant to your future, but if you can focus on these growing problems and you're passionate about them, you have to be passionate because this journey can be difficult, and if you don't have the passion, it can be hard to sustain the journey. So be passionate about solving this problem and then coming up with this novel thing. But then there's science you can apply, which is these experiments. That's really the core of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, but you test that by running experiments in the real world. In the case of a startup, that real world is market feedback, right? So, and then you grow it after you've proven that traction, and then you can expand into adjacent market opportunities and integrate all these components together and have the platform, which is truly valuable for a business at scale. So with that, I'm going to come to an end with my prepared remarks, and if you want to take questions, I'm happy to take them.
That was amazing, Ashar. I guess luckily I can't see myself on video, but I think that you can probably hear me.
I can see you.
Oh, yeah, that's even more frightening, actually. We have questions that are starting to come in, and we'll bring students in. May I ask, or maybe I can do this too, that we kind of unshare for just a moment?
Okay.
I'm going to actually unshare if you don't mind.
Sure, please.
I think I did it.
Okay.
Let's try that one more time. There we go.
Okay.
Fantastic. That was so incredibly rich. I thank you so very, very much. I know we have a question coming in, and actually I thought maybe Iklak, who's been listening so quietly and who was our moderator from last week, Iklak Sidhu, Chief Scientist and Founding Director for the Satarja Center, might want to kick us off with his question.
Yeah, all right, thank you. First of all, fantastic talk. I loved it. And I will preset this with, I've seen a lot of talks before. And I think something really interesting that you kind of added to all the discussion that we've had up till now is this idea of don't worry about whether you can solve it, worry about the problem, purely just like the problem. Like, what is this problem, and do people agree with this problem, and kind of making that, well, what would the ideal solution look like, and so forth, and kind of not start with what you can do. And my question, so I think, first of all, that's great advice for everyone. And given that, and you've got your DARPA example of how you found your first problem, can you give some examples really to the whole audience? Where else might they look for what those problems might be, or maybe you even have ideas about what some of these big problems are. But I think help everybody take that next step of finding the problem without caring that they have the solution. I'm going to go back into non-video mode and let you answer, and of course I'll let moderation happen for all the rest of the questions after that.
Right. So a general rule is problems are going to be found at the boundaries of change. Whenever you have change, new things are coming about, it creates a new set of problems. The creation of the internet itself was a great thing, but having the internet created a set of problems that companies came in and tried to solve. So if I have fast networks, that's great, but there's going to be problems in having fast networks. So how you think about a problem statement is at the boundaries of technological change. Machine learning and big data, great. Well, it creates a lot of problems, right? So you have to build a lot of things to fix the technologies that are coming in, because these technologies are not perfect out of the box, and managing them and making them usable requires a lot of other technology, right? So in general, look for change. If you're looking at a consumer product, well, it might be that you have personally experienced these problems, right? So when you find yourself frustrated at something, and you find that lots of other people are frustrated by the same thing, well, that is an opportunity disguised as a problem. So problems and opportunities are the flip of one another. And so for a consumer product, just think about life, right? And would you love to have something, and that's a consumer. For enterprise, you need to talk to enterprise customers, or what I did, I looked at what they were looking for solutions for, and I said, this is an amazing thing, because if the DoD can't solve this, I'm pretty sure the Fortune 500 and the Global 2000 can't solve it either. So that's a great market opportunity. Or like you are building an enterprise product and you were frustrated with the fact that it wasn't done right, and you have a chance to do it right? There's all these ways, because things that don't work well, think about ways to make them way better, so that usability, efficacy, all of these things are much better than incumbents. So these are general places I would look for. And like I said, it's a bit of an art form.
That's great. As you can see, Ashar, we're slowly adding students, and Callum, you had a question.
Hi. Yeah, I was curious if you were ever tempted to return to Terra Spring or cloud computing more generally, and if not, kind of when do you decide to like leave a good problem behind, even if you see it growing more and more into what you thought it would be?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I left TerraSpring, everybody in the investor community thought I was going to do another cloud computing startup. And for me personally, I think there's probably rich opportunities there still. And part of what I'm doing in Bedrock, by the way, is to address fundamental issues in the cloud. So ultimately, not what we're offering today, but what we offer down the road with Bedrock is going to solve very fundamental problems of secure computing in the cloud, right? Because we think we can do a much better job than anything that's out there. So that's going to be an indirect return for me into cloud. But all these years, personally speaking, I like to learn new things, and I get burnt out by thinking only about one class of problem, right? So for me to stay engaged and excited with my own life, what I do is I open the aperture on what I'm looking at, and I try to look at a wide variety of things, right? So I shifted focus simply because I wanted to learn about cyber attacks and cybersecurity, and this was a great opportunity to do it by building a company around it, right? So it also, and while I was running it for many, many years, my relaxation time during FireEye was to think about these other problems, which I'm working on now, like the clean energy problem for distributed power grids, right? So it was a way to keep me interested and excited, because you can get bogged down in the details of one kind of problem, and you just want like a change, you know, a change of experience and some fresh air. And so these other domains bring fresh air into my life.
Thanks,
you so
Star.
much. Yeah.
That's great. Kaiwen Liu, you had a question. You just need to unmute.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your time and your great presentation. I was wondering, so how do you personally stay safe on the internet, on your day-to-day life?
Yeah, so, you know, somebody asked that question, how do you stay safe? Commercial technologies, probably like consumer technologies, are not up to the mark to protect you against a really sophisticated attacker, right? So if you want to be safe from like China or Russia with some antivirus or whatever you have, it's not going to protect you. However, the random sort of financially motivated attack on your bank account, that's relatively straightforward behavioral change. Is be very suspicious of people asking you to do things that require you to divulge your password or some other thing that they can use against you, your social security number. So just don't fall for anything that looks legitimate. That's typically social engineering. And even clicking on links or documents, if there's something amiss about it, don't do it, right? Those are usually malware laden, right? So attacks, phishing attacks are typically mounted in this fashion. And so it's a behavioral change, because the technology, like I said, consumer technology will not protect you against a truly sophisticated attacker. And by the way, enterprise technology won't either, which is sort of why I was motivated to start Bedrock.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Abrar, you had a question?
Yeah, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm an undergrad studying computer science, like probably half the audience. And I'm a younger student, so I haven't really specialized yet. So I was wondering, if I were to get into cybersecurity, what kinds of courses, personal projects, outside skills should I be acquiring? And on a related note, what kind of mindset, what type of person really exceeds in a cybersecurity role?
Yeah, great question. So, so I kind of taught myself cybersecurity by reading all those papers in the early phases of FireEye. However, what I knew prior was very helpful. So what I had done before that was a lot of operating system work, right? So understanding how operating systems work is very beneficial, because the attackers are using some element of normal program flow and they're disrupting that, right? So just having a really good understanding of low-level programming whether it's assembly, whether it's computer architecture, understanding that really well, because the attackers understand that really well. So the defender has to be very conversant with all the fine details of not just the macro elements of computer architecture, but the micro elements of computer architecture. And not just the macro elements of programming, but the micro elements of programming, right? So being a great system programmer and a great system architect will help you think about how the bad guys are thinking about the world, because they're leveraging gaps in the way systems are built. They're all leveraging some error or some defect, right, in the way systems are constructed to exploit the system. So understanding the system architecture, from microarchitecture to operating systems to how compilers work and how code is laid out, that's all very useful if you want to then think about sort of the cybersecurity element of that.
That's quite interesting.
And networking. So networking was the other thing that I had spent a fair amount of time in. I built many protocol stacks from scratch, TCP, IP, and there are a whole bunch of attacks that rely on network protocols. So understanding network protocols is also very important.
Gotcha.
So,
Thank you so much.
Rohan, you had the next question. However, I'm going to ask Connor to ask a totally different type of question, just to kind of break it up a little bit. Connor, can you hear me?
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have a camera right now, but I just had a kind of less serious question. If you've watched a cybersecurity related TV series called Mr. Robot.
No.
Oh, okay.
Well,
I
Connor,
don't know about it. Never heard about it. So sorry.
just tell Ashar a little bit about it and why you think it'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting show. It takes from the perspective of a cybersecurity engineer in a small company, and how he kind of alone and with a small group was able to make a huge impact and cause a lot of damage to like a large conglomerate company, and how, you know, a really skilled hacker can do a lot of damage.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, so it doesn't take a lot of people to construct sophisticated cyber attacks. A lone hacker can be pretty deadly by himself. And just so you're aware, the defender's job is probably a few orders of magnitude harder than the attacker's job, because the attacker has to find one way into your system. The defender has to anticipate all the many different ways and plug them, right? So the defender's job is kind of like the attacker's job on steroids. So like I was saying, when I was playing cyber chess with myself, what was the other side? The other side was an attacker, right? I'm going to defeat this. I'm going to find ways around it. And there were so many countermeasures that one could think of, and you have to anticipate those countermeasures. And I'll tell you this, there was a countermeasure that I thought about in the 2004-05 timeframe that actually manifested in 2009 on the famous attack that happened from that country that is called the APT country on large tech companies. And we had not seen that attack, but it happened, and we had built a countermeasure for that, so we were able to detect that. So it's really important. And yeah, cyber attackers, they can be very solo and they can do a lot of damage. Yeah, there were attackers that came from Iran, and they shut down pretty much 75% of Saudi Aramco. That's from Iran, by the way.
Interesting.
And there was a very sophisticated attack on Iran from a non-trivial threat actor. So yeah, so you have non-trivial threat actors, and then you have nation states, and they can all do a lot of damage. And a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, can be accessed in ready-made toolkits even. So you don't have to be thinking about all the elements of the attack. You can acquire toolkits, and there's an Achilles heel today. Like if I wanted to take down some large computing infrastructure, there's an Achilles heel today. The trusted computing base is really not secure. So I can exploit that and find ways to bring down anything they have. Any cybersecurity software they have can be defeated using an attack on the core privileged code of that platform.
Wow,
Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Connor. It sounds like Ashar, you could do the Mr. Robot, sequel or something. Rohan, thank you for waiting so patiently. I know you have a question.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I was curious because your master's work was in, if I remember correctly, was in writing a compiler for IC layout, which is, pretty different from cybersecurity. So I'm wondering how you went from, whatever base knowledge you had about networking and, and how you went from that to knowing enough about cybersecurity to write the core technology for a company that was used by the U.S. Defense Department.
Yeah, so in between Berkeley and even TerraSpring and FireEye, I worked for 10 years at Sun Microsystems, and I built a wide variety of stacks there, from operating systems. So I did some core work in the Sun operating system and worked at sort of very low layers of the operating stack. And I built many different network protocol stacks. And these two pieces of knowledge became very handy when you're thinking about cyber attacks, because they come in over the network and they leverage a system vulnerability, right? So understanding the system and the network aspect became, and I had done, not in the context of cybersecurity, but generally building network protocol stacks and generally building either device drivers or operating system constructs in an earlier life allowed me to leverage that domain knowledge into the facets of the cybersecurity solution that I built.
I see. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
That's pretty amazing. Thank you, Rohan. So I've been hoping that we would get some questions from the other side of the aisle, so to speak. So I'll ask Maya Brickard. I think, Maya, you've been waiting for a little while. Maya, can you hear?
I can hear, but I have spotty service, so I'm not sure it's going to come through.
Don't worry about the video. Just ask your question.
Okay, you mentioned that you shouldn't worry about kind of the boundaries and what's possible and what's not possible. But if it's something, for example, that somebody with a lot of resources, say Google, has tried before and failed to complete, is it worth bailing on? Like, you think you have this great idea, but there's so many rules and regulations to overcome it. Do you pursue that when other people have tried and failed?
Yeah, so it depends, right? So if other people have tried and failed, by the way, after I built FireEye and I took it into different parts of the DoD, they had tried to do something like this and they had failed, right? So just because somebody else has failed doesn't mean that future efforts will not succeed, but it's important to understand why they failed, right? If you have a good understanding of why an earlier effort failed, in the case of the DoD, they never anticipated all the countermeasures, right? So I spent all that time playing cyber chess with myself, thinking about all the countermeasures so that, hey, what if the malware does this, that, and the other on the virtual machine? Well, there were all these countermeasures, right? So you have to think about what led to the failure and why and how you're going to address it. In the context of my new startup, this has also been tried and people have failed at doing it, right? So while I have not succeeded yet, I kind of know why they have failed, and I'm trying to address the root cause of why they have failed in the earlier iterations of trying to solve this problem. So blindly trying to solve it may not be effective, but if you deeply understand why it failed, then you can come up with a better solution. And so in both FireEye and with Bedrock, we are doing that. And these are efforts that have failed in the past.
Thank you for that question, Maya, who I think lost the connection, but I know everybody appreciates that answer. And yeah, fantastic. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for the great talk.
Actually, Vivek, I'm sorry to do this. I see your picture. I love you having on there, but I want to be conscious that Adriana has also been waiting. Vivek, stay
Oh,
on.
I didn't realize that. That's my bad. Sorry.
No, that's actually my bad. Adriana, do you want to start your video? And if not, we'll let Vivek start. There you go.
Hey, sorry, I don't really have the best service. Thanks for letting me or ask a question. I wanted to know if there was any information that you knew now or any technical skills that you know now that you wish you knew before creating FireEye, or just like anything that you'd like to share.
Well, I think I kind of alluded to this, which is this false sense of product market fit, right? When I was doing the 1.0 version, just because you have a few sales, it doesn't mean you have a repeatable sales cycle. So I tried to stress that in my summary, is that you will find tire kickers who might take some of your products, and maybe you're a good salesperson, and I guess maybe I gave a good pitch, right? And they said, okay, sounds good, I'll try it. And you get 2 or 3 or 4 customers to buy it, but it's not something that repeats from customer to customer, right? And so not building a go-to-market engine, which means a field force and all these other things, before you prove that, because what did I have to do then? I had to go fire everybody. I had to go fire that field force, because in reality, I did not have product market fit. So it's really important. That is the most fundamental thing you want to do. And you want to expend the least amount of resources to prove that point. Because every experiment, you get this amount of money, and then the timer starts winding down. You're running out of cash because you're making payroll, right? So you want to elongate that timeout on cash, and you want to do that with spending the least amount of resources. So if you have to be the salesperson, it doesn't matter whether you're comfortable doing that or not. That's the best way to figure out whether you have a repeatable sales cycle. So I ended up doing that in the 3rd iteration of the product, where like just me running around all over the country, selling the product myself to prove that I have a repeatable sales cycle. And then building the field up a second time. But it would have been nicer if I never built it up the first time.
That's good to know. So we have a number of questions that are coming in, but before we go to those questions, and Vivek, you've been really, really patient. I just wanted to remind everybody that as far as I know, on Thursday at 12 Pacific time, 3 p.m. East Coast time, Ashar has so graciously agreed to do a roundtable. When we put the code up later, we'll do the link for you to attend the roundtable, just in case we don't get all the questions. But we'll keep going as long as you're able to. And Vivek, go ahead, ask your question, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again, Ashar, for the great talk. I was curious in terms of the idea of social impact. I know some entrepreneurs start out with the idea of a company that, while also making money, creates social impact. So I was curious what your experience was with that. And also on the flip side, once you have a large company that's beholden to shareholders, how does that relate to, keeping a focus on social impact?
Yeah, so social entrepreneurship, I think, is a great idea, and there are lots of people trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, make a social impact as well as return a profit. I have tried to do the social impact mostly through philanthropy versus trying to thread the needle too tightly on that front, right? So educational software for underprivileged background children, it's a great thing to do. I would rather do that as a charity than make money. The reason is, if you're trying to sell a solution to an underprivileged group, it's kind of like taking from the poor to give to the rich, right? That's the reverse of what you want to do, right? So from a social impact perspective, I've decided to focus more on that from a philanthropy perspective. And then from a venture and a startup perspective, it's really to make a market impact. That's sort of my personal philosophy at the moment.
That's a great answer. And actually, I am kind of curious, what are the philanthropies that what do you look for when you're doing, I don't know, you call it investing, or when you're donating your time?
Yeah, I'll give an example of a couple of things I've done. The most recent thing I did was I was asked to give the commencement speech at this university in Pakistan. It's the country I was born in. And the prime minister of the country was the founder of this university. And so they asked me to come and give the commencement. And right after my speech, the prime minister got up and lamented the poor state of agriculture in the country, which is 70% agricultural by population, right? Yet the agricultural output was pretty minuscule because of a wide variety of problems. And then after that, I'm also on MIT's visiting committee, and MIT went through this transformation of the College of Computing and sort of infusing AI into every domain. And then I thought about the idea of applying machine learning and AI to the problem of agriculture in developing world countries. So I funded a program at that university, which is philanthropy, and they're going to build a lot of things, and they've started building a lot of things, which is thinking about the problems of poor farmers, right? So rich farmers have equipment and lots of other things, and there's a lot of agricultural tech for that, but how do you think about agricultural technology that can boost the yield per acre or the economic impact to a poor farmer by applying low-cost technology, right? So that's an example of something I just recently did, and there's a whole bunch of professors who are working on it. And actually, I get excited because I work on all these different areas that I know nothing about, such as looking at leaves and looking at the quality of the plant by analyzing leaves, and looking at pesticides and all these other things using machine learning. And so it's an interesting another sort of way for me to learn about new areas. So that's an example. The other thing that I tried to focus on, but I'm still kind of trying to find a way to thread that needle, was how to bring high quality education to underprivileged children, where the teacher is unable to explain the concept in the best possible way. So I built a fair amount of technology. I'm still trying to get it rolled out on how to improve the quality of education that is being imparted by teachers that are not the best teachers in the world, right? So that was another initiative, and I have a few others, but I think that gives you a sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know. I think we'll have Karen Shaw, if you want to put your video up. Vivek, thank you very much. Ask the last question. And while that question is on, Ashar, just so you know, Swetha is going to share the password for tonight. And so don't feel rushed, but that will be in the background, and we'll try to finish up at 6:30 then.
Sounds good.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative. My question was, like, one way to identify some disruptive technologies or create a disruptive solution is to identify a problem before the market identifies it or addresses it, and then working on that. So my question is, what disruptive technologies are you looking at today that you think of potential? And also the hot topics of today in computer science, the big data and ML, where everyone seems to be focused. Are those the places to go for innovation going ahead?
Now, those are great questions. Yeah. So the truth is that there is an incredible diversity of issues in the world, right? So finding one that is amenable to a great solution that you can bring value to, right? Those are the things you have to think about. What can I bring value to that is going to have profound impact on the world in an area that excites me, right? From a customer perspective to a technology, if there's technology involved, you have to find the intersection of these different sets, right? I can add value, it's going to have profound impact, it's undersolved, it's unlikely to be better solved by an incremental adjustment of the incumbent solutions, right? If an incremental adjustment to an incumbent solution will fix it, but then if you bring it, somebody will featureize that in their next version of the product. That's not good. So you have to think about sort of coming outside the box with a trajectory that is not the trajectory of an incumbent solution, right? That's now big data. Big data is for machine learning and big data. There's of course a whole slew of problems in that area and managing that, and of course now there's even cyber attacks on training data, and there's companies trying to solve that problem, right? But so there's the big data problem, but there's also the little data problem, right? And I think the little data problem is probably the harder problem, and there's probably some interesting work to be done on when you have little data to work with, and how do you learn from that?
Thank you very much. So little data and so like you mentioned you're a venture investor now, or you're an investor in many ventures. What are some of the are you looking at little data or any other technologies?
I haven't invested in any of these areas personally yet, because I like to understand the issues a little bit better. And so again, it's an exciting space to learn, because there's so much to be done, and there's so much that still has not been done, right? That's an understatement. So there's still a lot of work that can be done in all of this area, and applying sort of learning to that. My investments are in more traditional technology areas. I've invested in some CPU technology companies. I've invested in some sort of payment technology, and sort of, you know, the next iteration of managing retail stores and things like that. But the more interesting investment for me is where I'm the entrepreneur investor, as I am in Bedrock, as I am in Skylectric. So that is where I spend more of my personal cycles on.
I appreciate the question, Karen. I also appreciate, Ashar, your time going from top to bottom, giving us broad scope ideas, answering such individual questions, and going through things step by step. This is one of the most interesting sessions that we've had, because you have been so detailed. And I want to thank you on behalf of everybody in the room, and let's hear some applause.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
It was fantastic. I also want to remind everybody that, as far as I know, if we're lucky, Ashar will also be able to do a roundtable in a more intimate setting. Sometimes it takes people to warm up a little bit for questions, as we saw, they start coming toward the end. You are doing so much, and so we are incredibly grateful for your generosity of time, and wish you a good evening, because it's late in Florida.
Yes, and then same to you. Great evening to everybody there. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Good night, guys.
Good night, everyone. Swetha and Rishi, thank you both very much. And it'll be fun. Hopefully we'll have a nice group also for the roundtable. That'll be exciting for us to do. So we'll see how that goes. The code for the quiz, asks Ravi, is fiery, small f, small I, small e, small r, small y. As in, well, I won't say it and confuse anybody. Fantastic. I'm going to stop recording.